Welcome back, everybody. This is Chapter 6 of Price Analysis, a fundamental approach to the study of commodity prices. Now, Chapter 6 introduces the concept of a balance sheet, and a balance sheet is the primary, most important tool for making a fundamentals-based price forecast. So what do we mean by a fundamentals-based price forecast? The basic idea about what a balance sheet is it's an accounting of our expectations about what supply and demand will be when we harvest that crop. And it's continuously updated by analysts in the trade and by statisticians and economists and agronomists at the USDA. And one of the most widely followed USDA reports is what's called the WASDE, World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. And every month a balance sheet is released on all of the major commodities. And it kind of boils the whole current year's expectations about crop yields and about usage to a number that we'll cover in a minute. And it really informs people's expectations about price forecasts. So what exactly are we going to do in this chapter? Like I said, we're going to introduce the balance sheet for a commodity. And we're going to look at it row by row and talk about what each row means. In the following chapters, we'll look at how you might go about forecasting each row in the balance sheet. But today we'll focus on what each row means and what it is actually keeping account of. And we'll also introduce the concept of a marketing year and think through the times that we'll be updating these balance sheets. So for example, since we have to harvest a crop before we can use it, we'll be updating our expectations about acres and yield before we would probably be making major updates to the rows that keep account of the use, because we're going to have to realize what the supply is through harvest and accounting of what acreage and yields were before we actually get relevant data about how much demand there is for the stuff. So we'll talk in detail about those timing issues as well. And when it's all said and done, I want you to go back to those balance sheets that we'll be going through below and make sure you understand for each and every cell which cell is estimated by the USDA and which cells are calculated. That's an important part of demonstrating that you've understood exactly what a balance sheet is and where those numbers come from. Okay, so let's jump right in and start talking about it. Like we said, the balance sheet keeps track of expectations about supply and demand for the commodity. So let's start with supply first. For a commodity, especially a crop-based commodity like corn, soybeans, or wheat, the supply is determined primarily by the number of acres planted and the realized yield. So we've got this figure here, figure 1, that kind of illustrates the supply and demand model before and after planting. So before planting, a farmer could actually make adjustments at the margin to his decision about how many acres to plant. And if during that pre-planting season he sees that the price expectations are ratcheting up, especially relative to the prices of other things he might be able to plant. For example, if the price of corn is rising during that pre-planting time relative to soybeans, then it's probably true that the profitability of planting corn is increasing compared to the profitability of planting soybeans. So before planting, farmers can actually respond to price signals and supply more by planting more acres to that commodity if the price is high, or cutting back on what they had planned to plant if the prices are low. So you see in the left panel of figure 1 that the supply curve is actually upward sloped because we haven't planted the crop yet. That means the farmer can increase the number of acres he's allocating to that commodity if the market seems to be offering a high price. Now in the on the right panel, the supply curve is shown there as vertical. And we know that the supply isn't deterministically set when the farmer plants the crop, because we have uncertain realizations about what the weather is going to do and ultimately about what yield is going to be for that year, but in terms of expected supply or supply that can be affected by decisions the farmer can make after planting, there's zero price response. They've planted the acres, and you could argue that some post-planting management decisions could affect yields a little bit by properly applying side-dressed fertilizer or pesticide or insect management and that sort of thing, but essentially an expectation that supply curve is going to be vertical, and it's going to move to the right or to the left depending on what the weather turns out to be, but it will be vertical because the farmer will not be able to respond to price signals to increase his supply of that particular year's crop after the crop has already been planted. Okay, so to summarize, supply is affected by acreage decisions, and that's going to be impacted by the prices of crops that are competing for acreage. We often talk about how corn and soybeans compete for acres because farmers are all throughout the Corn Belt could just as easily plant corn or soybeans, and they're going to each season they're going to decide how many acres of which commodity they'll plant. So when the price of soybeans goes up, then the favorability shifts towards soybeans, and the price of corn goes up during that pre-planting season, then farmers will kind of add a little more corn acres to their plans. That's the major factor that drives acreage decisions. To a minor degree, pre-plant weather can impact decisions a little bit because some years the spring will be really wet during the corn planting season, and they won't be able to get all of the acres they intended to plant to corn planted before the window gets a little bit too late, and so they might shift some of those acres to soybeans. Now this, in the years that I've been following markets, this has been talked about many times during the spring when it gets a little bit wet, but it has in reality affected actual acreage decisions on a very, very small scale. So it is something that the market keeps track of during the spring season, but probably just because there isn't a whole lot else to worry about during that time. But given the machinery that farmers have today, as soon as they get a couple of days that are dry and a few days in the field, they can plant a lot of acres very fast, and that doesn't end up being all that important anymore as it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Supply is most certainly impacted by post-planting weather because we've talked about this a lot. Depending on how much it rains and depending what summer temperatures end up being, that's going to derive most of what the average yield is going to be for the nation. So that's really important. The third thing listed there is government policies. And we haven't had huge changes to that recently, so it's kind of a minor consideration. But we have had extensive farm programs administered by the federal government since the 1930s, really, and they involve, over time, they've involved a combination of subsidized crop insurance and price support policies and revenue supporting policies, and just various schemes to ensure that we don't have a mass bankruptcy of a majority of our farmers in any given year due to some random weather event like a severe drought. And we lived through 2012 with a very severe drought, and the farm programs worked pretty well because farm incomes did not suffer in 2012 because most farmers had purchased crop insurance that subsidized their income in the face of those severe yield losses. But those policies do have an impact on acreage decisions because you have to, in order to have the advantages of being in those programs, you need to plant the commodity that's covered. So all of the commodities that we'll talk in this class in terms of crops are on that list: corn, soybeans, wheat in particular, livestock not so much. But the presence or absence of those kind of income smoothing policies can impact the supply of those commodities for obvious reasons.